London. Concrete upon Thames. The big grey. Nearly 9 million people live here, many of them spending half their paycheck to live in a rat-filled bedsit above a Tesco just to call themselves a Londoner. A mostly subterranean species of British person that only cares about money or status and hates anyone with more money or status than them. The puckering centre of this anus town is backed up with snail-paced tourists, illustrious landmarks, and chain restaurants that sell steak made of shoe leather. You'll get some better food and breathable air down south of the river, but you'll also be jostling for space with ketamine-snorting students who are protesting the gentrification of the neighbourhoods that they're currently gentrifying. To the north, you'll find art industry snobs living in million-pound townhouses, living 4 doors down from drill rappers who are bragging about the murders what they done last Tuesday. The east is stuffed with bankers, Eurotrash wankers, and Cockney cab drivers who consider themselves the last real Londoners, even though they all live in Essex. The west is the only part of the city that isn't crammed with cretins, and that's because it's empty, filled with the micro-mansions of Russian oligarchs, corrupt politicians, and the rotting remnants of the British aristocracy. These are the people who really own London, and this is the story of how they ruined it. 1950s London was like a different planet. The streets were occasionally clean, heads were mostly hatted, and the river was filled with all the stuff that the city was pilfering from the rest of the planet. The British pound reigned supreme as the world's reserve currency. That was until the country went bankrupt, fighting 2 world wars and losing the empire that made it rich in the first place. India broke free of British control in 1947, starting a chain reaction of other countries deciding they didn't want a jewelry-topped 25-year-old as their god-queen ruler either. This was all very bad news for London, as it couldn't really afford any more wars, but it also couldn't afford to lose control of all the resources that it had acquired by gunpoint. After this, the only thing that was sustaining London as a financial powerhouse was its control over the world's largest trade funnel, the Suez Canal. While Egypt owned the land either side of it, Britain was the canal's largest shareholder, allowing London to take a tasty cut from every trading vessel that used it.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. The 85-year-old waterway, of which the United States is the second biggest user, brings a 3-power meeting in London to discuss the biggest threat this year has posed to world peace.
When Egypt nationalized the canal in 1956, Britain re-invaded this strategically important nation, killing thousands of civilians in the process. The international community, but mostly America, finger-tutted Britain with the threat of sanctions, sending the already faltering pound to the edge of collapse. Britain had no choice but to heroically retreat from Egypt, being replaced by the first ever UN peacekeeping operation, which was something that British propaganda actually thought was worth bragging about.
As they sail from portside, many will be asking the question, if they had not gone there in the first place, would the United Nations Emergency Force ever have come into being?
After Suez, London was pretty much broke. All that had to remember the glory days of empire were the many treasures and priceless artifacts that it keeps in the British Museum, still retained today under the internationally recognised principle of finders keepers, losers weepers. The British Empire itself was reduced to a few mosquito-ridden, resource-free rocks in the middle of the world's oceans. And we'll get back to them, but first I need to explain something about the City of London. Now, London the city is different from the City of London. I know that's confusing, but that's kind of the whole point. The City of London is actually a tiny square-mile section slap bang in the middle of Greater London. It sustains itself as a separate city within a city through tedious legal bureaucracy and archaic rituals mostly designed just to confuse outsiders. It's got its own police force and its own Lord Mayor, who wears a fruity little medal wherever he goes, looking like he's won first place in a shit-eating grin contest. The square mile takes its separateness so seriously that the Queen has to ask permission to even enter, even though her house is only 10 minutes walk away. not that she's walked anywhere in her life. While it follows these archaic rituals to the letter in public, in private, the city exists to skirt regulation, exploit loopholes, and to clean up dirty money. The city's modern borders are guarded by these big metal dragons, which is appropriate given the city's main role is to greedily guard piles of ill-gotten gold. Back in the middle of the last century, the city was going through an identity crisis. No longer the purse holders for the world's greatest empire, the chinless aristocratic freaks that ran London's oldest banks needed a new way to feel superior to everyone. Usually change isn't something the British upper classes handle very well. These are the kind of people that have an aneurysm if their cutlery isn't presented to them in the right order. But as the empire collapsed, London banks were forced to handle America's change. The dollar had replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency, so it was all about the Benjamins in the City of London and pretty much everywhere else. The dollar was so strong that even Soviet Russia needed to trade in them. But the Soviets were worried about having their US currency frozen by the Federal Reserve, so they deposited their dollars where they thought they'd be safe, in London banks. Seeing an opportunity, an unnamed executive at Midland Bank did what the city does best. He created a overly complicated financial ritual that turned money into better money. He invented the Eurodollar. Now look, this shit is a bit complicated, but once I'm done explaining it, you will sorta understand the basis of the world's financial order for the last 70 years. So it'll be worth it, alright? Eurodollars are US dollars held in banks outside of the US, and therefore cannot be controlled or regulated by the Federal Reserve. During this time, the Federal Reserve and pretty much everyone else was terrified of inflation, even more so than they are now. America remembered the Great Depression, and Europeans remembered how Germany went from carrying Deutschmarks in wheelbarrows to stitching swastikas to their sleeves in the space of a decade. So to keep inflation in check, the Federal Reserve restricted how much interest banks could earn from lending dollars to a measly 1%. But Midland Bank decided that their dollars didn't need to follow these rules. They could lend them out at higher interest rates to anyone they liked with no oversight from Uncle Sam. They could lend these dollars to, say, Russia, who no longer had to worry about US sanctions on their US currency. So the USSR could roll tanks into Hungary without having to worry about how America might feel about it. London no longer had the cash to invade countries or strip them of their resources, but they could act as the bank for all the countries and individuals that could. Nearly every major London bank copied Midland's great idea. Soon, even American banks were setting up shop in London so that they could trade in these unregulated super dollars too. This allowed London to compete with New York as the world's financial centre. And it also gave the city a use for all those pointless little islands it still owned. Welcome to the Cayman Islands, a tropical paradise full of surprises. These tiny little map dots 500 miles south of Florida boast clear Caribbean blue seas, white sands, and trillions in dirty dollars. The Cayman Islands is the 5th largest financial centre in the world, which means that it's only the second most surprising thing about them that they're technically British. The islands were first exploited in the 1700s for their natural abundance in delicious turtle meat. But overfishing colonizers quickly reduced the island's native population to soup. Its neighbour, Jamaica, became independent in 1962. The Caymans remained British mostly because Jamaica didn't want them, but also because they lacked enough natural resources to become an independent economic entity of their own. The story of the Caymans is typical of other British overseas territories like Gibraltar, a 6.8 square kilometre piece of limestone just sticking off the Spanish coast that's mostly populated by angry macaques and angrier British retirees. Or the British Virgin Islands, a place so far from civilization that its capital is called Road Town because, well, it's got a road in it. Though all of these poverty-smashed semi-states had one resource in common, a resource that turned out to be the City of London's lifeblood: confusion. the weird legal limbo that made these places both British and not British at the same time. This is why accountants and lawyers from the City of London landed Pond Road in the 1960s to draw up new banking secrecy laws for these islands. Companies could be formed with a minimum of paperwork. Shares could be held anonymously by you or someone you appoint. And there were criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosures. This is what allows violent criminals and garden variety tax cheats to bury their cash on these treasure islands without ever buying a plane ticket. Today, nearly half of the world's secrecy jurisdictions are British dependencies. When other countries complain about these British satellite havens pocketing their tax dollars, London says, "What are you going to do? These places are independent, they can do what they like." Even though Britain appoints their governors and can veto legislation, it just chooses not to. Make no mistake, London is the real secrecy jurisdiction. It's where the idea was cooked up, it's where most of the paperwork still gets done, and it's where these secretly owned assets actually have street addresses. The islands themselves are essential to the grift, but they are barely relevant in the day-to-day process. Whereas owning London luxury property, well, that is key if you want to hide your dirty money. The white pillared homes in this neighbourhood are some of the most beautiful in the city, evoking memories of Victorian grandeur. If you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of a 9-year-old chimney sweep suffocating in their walls. And if you look at their sales history and leaks from the Panama Papers, you'll see that the rich are still living off the back of the little guy. In 2019, it was estimated that nearly 90,000 homes in England and Wales were owned by the anonymous heads of shell companies based in places like the Caymans. The City of London itself has some of the country's highest property prices, but also has the highest proportion of empty homes. These fancy townhouses remain pristine, partly because owning them is more important than living in them. They're essentially show homes that don't show you who owns them. And this is achieved through a process called layering. Tax haven shell companies are like onions. They fucking stink. Actually, shell companies are more like bubble tea. They're a detriment to society at large, but they're also structurally similar. Most holding company structures actually contain dozens of different companies. Each of these shell companies will own different assets. A private jet there, a portfolio of stocks here, and maybe a luxury London townhouse. Homes on this street rarely sell for less than £10 million, traditionally owned by ex-prime ministers and retired celebrities, or more accurately, owned by their tax haven shell companies. All of these will be secretly registered in different territories, and these paper-thin businesses will be owned by different people, usually family members or paid associates. But all of these separate companies will ultimately be contained in a single, invisible financial instrument known as a trust. A financial trust is the most important and actually simplest financial instrument in the tax dodger's arsenal. It originates from medieval times, where a crusading knight could convey ownership of land to a guardian with the understanding that it would be given back when he returned from his genocidal holiday. No! Today, it remains a perfectly legal but barely documented agreement, which appoints a trustee to act as a legal custodian while concealing the true beneficiary. Basically, someone else holds the cup while you get the straw. Today, Eaton Square is unaffectionately known as Red Square because the Russian oligarchs have invaded without finding a shred of resistance. After all, it's been very profitable for Britain's youngest billionaire, Hugh Grosvenor, who inherited most of Eaton Square from his father, the previous Duke of Westminster. Most of these houses are in spitting distance of 10 Downing Street, who have been facilitating them for decades. By the 1980s, the City of London was rich again, partly by exploiting the power of its overseas territories.
Burnt-out yuppies may come and go, but smoked salmon and bubbly goes on forever.
The Eurodollar market had also grown faster than a fatberg in a London sewer. In 1980, the market was worth nearly $500 billion. By the end of the decade, it was worth over $4.8 trillion. So the City of London kept on with its gaudy little rituals and games of dress-up while it scrubbed the world's dirty money clean. The Bank of England still had one foot firmly rooted in the past, continuing archaic rituals that were meant to somehow stop the whole economy from grinding to a halt. Like printing money that no one would ever use and locking it away in a tiny little lunchbox.
Each is worth £1 million. They never go into circulation, performing only a highly technical banking function. They never leave the Bank of England, spending their lives in a little tin box.
As other financial hubs like New York caught up with London's tricks and began exploiting their own secrecy jurisdictions, London was forced to modernise in some ways. Everything changed in 1986 when the London Stock Exchange adopted electronic trading and made shouting their trades across a spittle-ridden floor redundant, with traders celebrating the end of this era in dignified, traditional British style. This moment became known as the Big Bang, as the British government enacted wide-reaching deregulation of the city.
It's going to change. The stock market will be a car park in 5 years' time. I'll have made a fortune, and that's what I want.
Trading became cheaper and more competitive, and centuries-old firms were bought by foreign owners. In just 2 years, the value of traded shares increased by 1,500%.
But you wouldn't mind being described as a yuppie yourself?
No, I am described as a yuppie. I'm the oldest living yuppie.
Many of those top-hatted public schoolboys were pushed out or retired. The city was now open to anyone who wanted to swap their soul for the tinny taste of cold hard pounds.
I wouldn't consider myself one, but friends tell me that I am, particularly at the golf club, so I've decided to come out of the closet. Yes, I probably am a yuppie.
The City of London reclaimed its throne as the world's financial centre, and even expanded beyond its old borders, building some of the city's ugliest skyscrapers on the Isle of Dogs. This was about where the meaningless, money-shuffling rituals of the city began to overtake the value of real things. Traditional industry across the country declined rapidly. Commodity trading was more profitable than producing commodities themselves. Instead of investing in manufacturing or infrastructure, British banks overwhelmingly lended to finance and speculative real estate. Today, the financial sector dominates the economy of the UK. It's responsible for nearly 10% of the entire country's economic output. I should say, I don't want to pay tax. Nobody enjoys it. What annoys me is that these people think they're exempt from it. And what annoys me even more is that it's ordinary people who end up footing the bill. Energy bills in the UK are spiralling. The cost of living generally is going fucking bananas. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Even the usually optimistic and empowering Martin Lewis is just one bell and placard away from declaring the end to be nigh.
We're going to have about 10 million people in fuel poverty. We have a real absolute, not relative, poverty issue going to come in the UK. As the money-saving expert who's been known for this, I am virtually out of tools to help people now.
Britain's ruling class is happy to let its foreign visitors get away with not paying tax because the money that they're saving is ending up in their back pocket / Bermuda-based holding company. Margaret Thatcher actually lived here until she croaked, although she never technically owned it, apparently happy not to pay tax to the country that she ran into the ground. We see another former Prime Minister acquiring West London property by purchasing a tax haven shell company from the Bahrainian Minister for Industry. I guess it's nice to see Tony contributing something to the Middle East besides a body count. We also see Viktor Fedotov, a Russian oil magnate accused of a $4 billion fraud scheme in Russia. He owns property here too, but he also secretly owned a UK energy firm which he used to donate £1.5 million to 34 separate Tory members of Parliament. After COVID, even the government is feeling the pinch. So the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, has come to all of us taxpayers with his porridge bowl outstretched, asking for some more. He has just enacted a substantial rise in the national insurance rate, and asking for no additional tax from his mates or his wife. Rishi's wife received £10 million last year because of stock she owns in her dad's company, but didn't pay a single pound of British tax by declaring her permanent residence to be elsewhere, even though when she lives here, she lives next door to the fucking Prime Minister. Meanwhile, this national insurance hike will hit ordinary Londoners the hardest for daring to live in a city where most of the opportunities still are, and where wages are only higher because the rent is so high. We lose about £15 billion to tax fraud every year, and much of it is being squirreled away in London's own secrecy jurisdictions. Tax doesn't mean anything to these people. It's something the little people need and the middle people pay. Hello, regular Ordinary Things viewers. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be real with you, this one was really difficult to put together, mostly because learning about complex financial instruments that are intentionally confusing is confusing. But also because I had this whole section on Russian oligarchs and their dirty money in London that, because of history happening in the background, what I was writing about kind of became outdated within about a week. So if the video seems a little bit disjointed in places, that's why. Next month, I'm going to pick a topic that's a little less fucky. I've always wanted to make a video about blimps. I just think they're neat, and I thought that would be fun. Before you go, I just want to give a few quick shout-outs. Firstly, to my patrons, you guys rock. I would not be able to make these kinds of videos without you. I must also shout out Naomi Fowler at the Tax Justice Network. She is amazing, and if you want to know more about this kind of thing, I really recommend checking out her podcast, where you can hear experts talk about it in detail. Alright, thanks for watching, and don't let the bastards grind you down. Bye!